Welcome to MetaPod, the podcast where we discuss operational execs and organizations that make and move stuff, and our common headaches, digital transformation, the forever labor shortage, and doing more with less. And now, the host of MetaPod, Ron Crabtree.
It's Ron Crabtree here, your host of MetaPod, and we're back to talk about, those three key things that companies involved with tangible goods tend to deal with, which would be the forever labor shortage, digital transformation, digitization of work, and the pressure, the endless pressure to do more with less. And I'm really happy to have with me today on our podcast, the gentlemen, so we got Lupe, Muñoz, and Steve McKeon. And they actually have their own podcast. I was a guest on not that long ago called The Leadership Exchange. And in that podcast, I was sharing some of my observations about what's changed for leadership in recent years. And we talked quite a bit about, how do you deal with it really effectively making change happen? So they're going to want to get into this topic around leadership and cultural transformation in the current times, because things have changed a lot. Not the least of which is, generational. You just think about the three big chunks of generational change we've seen and the needs of the workforce that moved. So they're going to be sharing with us some of their observations about the unique challenges currently facing leaders when it comes to establishing a real environment that supports an environment and a culture that really supports change. And so if that's something that interests you, I think you'll get quite a bit out of this discussion. Their focus is really going to be, in my mind, based on preparation we made, is more around the forever labor shortage directly impacted by the company's culture, how you behave. Are you an effective and, desirable employer is a huge piece of the forever labor shortage. And the other piece is developing people, right, that you do bring on and making them effective and then making them part of things you're going to change in the organization is a piece of the puzzle. Of course, their big interest is around continuous improvement. And so their angle is kind of be if you're driving continuous improvement, which, oh, by the way, if the forever labor shortage is a concern for you, if you aren't doing things like Lean and Six Sigma and other continuous improvement initiatives to eliminate waste, get rid of unnecessary activities, get more out of the people you have, especially if you can't hire any, you got to do more with less. So I think that's part of what they'll touch on. So with that, Lupe, Stephen, introduce yourself to our audience.
Great. Thank you, Ron. Lupe, I'll go ahead and start. So my name's Steven McKeon. I go by Steve. Been I would say a professional in industry for a little over 30 years. Started off in the aerospace, automotive sector, moved over into my own consulting practice for a short period of time before joining my largest client, and kind of moved into defense and defense contracting, and ended up landing recently in the wine industry. And it's been a really interesting journey, Ron, because it's taken me all over the world. I've seen all kinds of different cultures. And I would say that a couple things that really stick that I've learned in that space that apply here is that, you've got to understand the people side of any type of transformation. And that's kind of one of the things that, Lupe and I are excited to continue the conversation with you today in that space. So, Lupe, let me throw it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Ron, my background is somewhat similar to Steve's. I actually served in the military in the U.S. Army. I started my career out of college there, but then transitioned over to the manufacturing industry and really started to collect, I'll say, lessons through others and through experience of leadership and the impact of culture to organizations. And, I'm a big fan of operational excellence and Lean as well, and leadership, huge passion for leadership. And that's where me and Steve just managed to find ourselves in the same organization. And that is how we linked up and eventually were the two hosts for the Leadership Exchange podcast that you're referring to. So we're extremely happy, excited to be part of this show.
Okay, awesome. So great. So what we want to do next is kind of move into some diagnostics you guys would offer, three key areas that organizations should be thinking about, leaders need to be thinking about. I think you're going to talk a little bit about organizational leadership, the lens of high-performing work teams, and then the systems, right? And, what do we put in place to make it sustainable? So what we're looking for here is a diagnostic to help the audience understand What should I look at? Why am I looking at it? How do I determine the degree of a gap or an opportunity or a threat to my organization? And then after that, we'll pivot. And then we're looking for some sage advice about what do you do to actually address these things. So with that, let's tackle those diagnostics.
Sure. Ron, I'll go ahead, Lupe, and kind of lead in there, Ron, just because I wanted to reflect on a conversation we were having last time you, Lupe, and I got together. And that was really around a favorite author that you and I share, which is Cotter and his transformational change model, right? How to lead change in an organization. And as we were preparing for this podcast, Lupe and I were talking a little bit, and I recognized after my first kind of reading of John Cotter's book, Leading Change, and then having to lead a cultural transformation opportunity in the organization I was with, I had the mechanics down, and I did not, I was not successful. It took longer to kind of get through it, and it really is going to speak to some of the opportunities here with this podcast today, is because I missed the people side of it. I was so focused, in engineer by degree, our technical mindset of where's the tools, what's the problem, here's the fix, and just really missed that opportunity. And anyway, I just want to share that with you because I think it was really, once I finally recognized, or someone that actually had me read another book by Stephen Covey on trust, that it really, I recognized where I needed to focus, and some of that we'll talk about today. Lupe, you want to go ahead and introduce the kind of the points of discussion here?
Well, I think we aligned that you really want to be able to understand and observe specifically the level of trust within an organization, try to assess what are the behaviors that are either indicating that there is trust or there is a lack of trust, and then leadership commitment to
Wait a minute, I
change it.
got to ask a question here. So
Yes.
give us an example of how you put a measurement on that. In other words, give a practical story or an example, if you can, of going into an organization and asking the questions. What are the questions I'm asking to determine the degree of or the absence of trust? What is I'm listening for? How do I learn if we have a gap there? Give us a little meat here in terms of how do you determine if there's really a gap? How do you do that?
That's a really great question, Ron. Personally, I've experienced where I join a team, and the first thing I like to do is do one-on-one interviews to just understand people's perspective, understand what they see as the opportunities. I like to ask some very specific questions around what do you like the best about the team? What do you feel is the biggest opportunity for the team? And a lot of that can come out in that discussion, because people will start to I like to say, point outward when they talk about opportunities. They don't consider themselves to be part of the opportunity, and it's in the language that they use, right? They, um, he, she versus we, us, our opportunities. So some of those key words can be minor or subtle, but extremely powerful in determining that there may be an opportunity. And when I have gone to some organizations, it's all about they and everybody else is the problem and the cause of my problems, but not necessarily saying, hey, we as a team have an opportunity, and that can definitely be an indicator that there's a trust issue within the organization.
Let me ask a follow-on question. I've done a lot of this work myself over the years and had some success. And one of the tools I use it's called an Affinity Diagram. And basically you have those conversations and you capture what people were saying. Then you go back and you actually map it to what was it pointing at? Was it pointing at relationships with bosses? Was it pointing at relationships with peers? Was it pointing at not having the information needed to do the work? What frustrates me and makes me crazy. And then we can actually put a little bit of a yardstick to that. So I'm interested in, how do you put a yardstick to it and say, in this area, we don't have a gap. In this area, we really do. And this is how big the gap is. Talk to me about how you actually put a yardstick on that and kind of grade it.
Well, Ron, I'll jump in here and just mention that you called out one of the tools that we typically use, which is the Affinity Diagram. We find that gives everybody a voice in the process, and even those that don't want to participate, you can get them to kind of share some of their knowledge and some of the challenges that they have. And, once you've done that exercise and you're able to, kind of line on, hey, these are the big issues, the component of, how many there are, right, in one category, and then relatively, being able to go in and have the team then vote, okay, here's what we came up with, team, let's prioritize these, right? And then from there, I think it really comes down to, working off the list so they see progress, small incremental
Now,
improvements that you can
and
make.
we're not going to get to what to do yet. We're going to
Yeah.
focus in on how to determine the gap. Let's just focus there. And what we do about it will become more obvious. But first, we've got to get to what are we looking for? How are we going to measure that? How can we gauge or say we have a gap here and it's going to keep us from being successful and putting a natural measurement somehow to that? And infinity diagramming technique is one of them. I was just curious what you guys have had success with there.
Yeah, so the Affinity Diagram, I would say also using force field analysis to, kind of look for those, areas where the change is being resisted. And then I think the other thing that Lupe, you can add to this as well is just the um, commitment to the team to really kind of walk through the exercise of um, you know the role play, like, well, how did that occur, right? And really trying to get rid of, okay, who is they? And it's that extra conversation that you can add to create the value of, hey, what's really going on here? Lupe, you want to add to that?
Well, I want to pivot slightly on the same topic around the other piece is, you need to understand leadership's accountability and how they're behaving because right it all starts from my perspective, it all starts from leadership. So if they're setting the tone for the team, there's no accountability from their perspective, and they're using a lot of that same language that I was mentioning around, hey, they, especially I get especially frustrated when people start to talk about the team members as they, like, well, if they would just, get on board, right? Indicating to me that they're the problem versus, hey, if we could figure out how to engage and get buy-in with our team, then that's a more inner reflective exercise than what their initial response was or statement was.
Can I ask a question here?
Yeah.
So there's two pieces to this in my mind. I'm curious whether you're getting into both of these. One is, I'll call it, what is the organizational org chart job description responsibility for management? Do we actually understand what they've been charged with? That's a piece of it. And another crucial, and then how are they even doing it, right? That's one piece of it. And then the other piece is how are they perceived, right? By the folks in the organization that they either work for them or rely on them and interface with them. So help me understand, are you looking at both of those elements or just one of them?
Steve, you want to take
Yeah,
that?
sure. I'll start in there. So it's interesting you bring that up because, one of the interesting things that we've been looking at is, when there's lack of clarity in that org structure and even in the job description piece, Ron, where it's really calling out, areas of responsibility. And so I think, one of the ways that we've looked at those gaps in that space is, is this a really generic job description or can we really define someone's roles? And at the leadership level, a lot of times those job descriptions are very vague and grandiose. So, really trying to put a little bit more tangible detail there in terms of leadership standard work is key in my mind. You want to add to that, Lupe?
Yeah. And I can speak for a firsthand experience with a team that I'm going to describe as they were work focused. The leadership team was work focused versus people focused. And to add to what Steve's saying, the job descriptions talked all about the tasks that they had to perform as it pertained to the job, as far as, making widget A or, processing this particular transaction. There was nothing in those job descriptions around how do you collaborate? how are you an effective communicator? Are you a team player? And really some of those things that are more critical when it comes to the people aspect of the organization. And so a lot of times that can be very revealing as far as like, wow, we really are just focusing on the work and not really focusing on people.
You do advocate then this notion of let's make sure the structure is correct. In other words, we have an intended outcome of the behavior and what happens from communications and all these other things out of leaders. Does it even exist? And how robust is it? And then secondly, how is it perceived? The other side of it is this is what we say we're doing, blah, blah, blah. This is, what we intend, but what's being heard in reality is the other piece and bouncing those off each other. Is that where you're headed here?
Absolutely. And I would continue that with the comment about it's in the execution of that vision or the execution of the culture that we're wanting. So a lot of times, to your point, Ron, there are leadership organizations that talk a good talk. They say all the right things, but the interpretation of what that looks like and what that sounds like at the floor level is where it completely falls apart. And so you've got to really understand, and you must work on all the leaders throughout the organization, especially the ones that have that daily interaction, hourly interaction with the team members that are performing the work. They need to understand how that vision and that cultural target that you're shooting for is transferring into their specific behavior. Am I being a servant leader? Am I listening, or am I talking and giving orders? Am I working to ensure that my position of authority is reinforced, or am I working to give the authority where I can to those people around the team?
Cool.
And Ron, I would add,
So,
going back to the question about, what are the metrics that we're looking for early on? It's, the big ones are turnover, transfers. Are we seeing a lot of employee complaints and cases? And, that is in and of itself a big indicator. And what's interesting is a lot of times organizations hold that information private. They don't want to share. So leaders are completely blind to the fact what's going on in that organization. So we found that's, as far as their kind of early on measures of how are we doing, those are gateways as well.
so I don't suppose you've run in situations where got enough samples, right? You've talked to enough people in different functions and at the levels, then go back and say, is this an organizational wide phenomena, or are there pockets of excellence and pockets of not so good, depending on where you are functionally in the organization? Have you gotten that far with that idea?
I'm a big fan of maturity models, Ron, and so using maturity models, I have found that it creates a really clear way to communicate kind of the state of the condition, right? So especially when you're talking about cultural transformation, you're really looking for those key attributes. And to your point, what you can identify with, some employee surveys and some other, real easy to use tools, where the strengths are, where those gaps are, and kind of where you're at in that curve. So a model of very immature going all the way to a level 5 highly mature state of that, whatever that culture change is you're going with. And you can start to put a line in the sand as to, hey, this is where I think we are. What do you think we are? And it just opens up the dialogue. And then especially when you've got some really good attributes that you can list underneath there, it's important. And I think sharing that information, again, a lot of times I've seen studies done in organizations and they're like, oh, we can't share this with the rest of the organization because it shows the vulnerability or the weakness. And it's really the opposite. You've got to get that out to get the organization working together on, the gaps, right, that we want to close. Lupe, I know you've got some examples as well in that space. Anything else you want to share there?
No, I think you covered it well, Steve.
All right. So I think you did a great job here on the first diagnostic point that I understood: organizational leadership, their commitment to vision, attributes, kind of putting a measuring stick to that. And then What did you get into this looking at the lens of the high performance team yet, or is that next?
That is next, Ron.
Okay.
So, so obviously, just having the leadership aspect is obviously critical, but it's not the only thing you need. You need to be able to understand how are people feeling that you mentioned earlier around how are they perceived. The opposite or the opposite side of that coin is how are the team members feeling, right? And so understanding are there people issues? Are there employee relations issues happening? Steve mentioned the attrition rate. What does that look like? Is it an organization that has long tenured team members, employees, or is it one that has really very short tenured employees? That could be an indicator if it's not a startup business that maybe there's something that's not getting people to, stay within that organization for very long. And some of the same things that you look for with leaders is the piece of trust. So trust is throughout for us is one of the critical foundations that you have to have effective cultural and to have great performance. And so you'll see that a lot in what we talk about, and the attributes of those people and the behaviors that they demonstrate around self accountability. Am I using those words? Am I behaving differently? And also, interestingly, I like to go through an organization and I start to just take a look at how people respond to me, especially if I'm new. If they respond to me by not even recognizing that I'm there, or walking the other way, when they see me maybe approaching to ask a question, that tells me something about the culture within that team, versus people that openly welcome me and say, "Hey, who are you? What are you doing here? Oh, I heard that somebody was going to come to visit." And they're like, what, they start to ask questions. So you can tell that they have this comfort and this level of safety, that they feel that they can do that, versus, hey, I have no idea who this person is. Maybe they're looking to reduce our head count. Maybe so there's a gamut of things that people can think of. And I found that just looking at the way they respond to you as you walk through the work area is a very telling thing to
So
experience.
how do you boil that down to a metric or a measure saying, we're looking at trust? Is it a scale of 1 to 5? I can say, on 1 to 5, well, 1 is there is no trust. Everybody's like, hiding out. And a 5 is, geez, it couldn't be any better on the trust scale. You try to attempt to put a number to that or some kind of metric to give feedback to leadership saying you've got an issue or not, right? Is there a way to put a yardstick on that?
Yeah, Ron, to me, in my background, environmental health and safety, I've had to do a lot of like assessments of the safety culture in organizations. And to answer your question, yes, you have to be able to go put a number on that, and it can be as simple as just putting together that employee survey, defining what good looks like and what good doesn't look like, and then you know creating a way that it's the employees feel they can confidently provide the feedback. And then I think it's courage at a management team to look at the feedback honestly, right, and not react to it uh, punitively in terms of hey, they clearly don't understand this. So from that standpoint, I think that's probably one of the best tools that you can use to get that assessment, is really to go out and engage with employees with those opinion surveys, and then have the courage to review the information and share it openly within the leadership team, but also back into the employee group so they know, hey, they've heard our message. And and then you can start saying, okay, here's what we think we can do about it. What are your thoughts?
Cool.
Lupe, any more to add there?
No, I was not particularly about sort of the metric associated with that. I think the survey is really great because it gives you, very measurable, quantifiable metric that can tell you if you're moving the needle.
All right, cool. So, do we want to move on to that third diagnostic around the systems and that part?
Yes.
Perfect.
And so the third one is, you've got leadership. You're understanding what that looks like. You're understanding the team members through the lens of high performance work teams. But the last piece that we like to focus on is, what do the systems, or are there systems, and are they there to support the right behaviors? In some cases, there are no systems. In some cases, there are some, but maybe not the ones that are the specific ones that enable that culture and that transformation. And so, again, going back to my example around, like, hey, are we work focused, or are we people focused? So if your systems are all around supporting, right, it's a business management system. So it ensuring that the work gets done and is getting delivered, things are getting delivered as they need to, per schedule, to the customer. And all your systems are really around that. That's maybe an opportunity. But do you have a training system? Do you have a management of change system? Do you have communication system focus on engaging the team members, making them feel like they're part of the business versus just working for the business, and making sure that there's a system for continuous improvement, uh, specifically with their voice in mind. Because usually, if you're fixing the issues that are making employees' lives difficult at work, you're probably improving the work that's going to be resulting in better product, faster product, less defects, etc. Steve?
Yeah, Lupe, I would add that from the assessment standpoint of the systems, really kind of understanding that piece of it and where the gaps are, Ron. The thing that comes up in almost any assessment you do is, the need to improve communication, right? And even if there's a communication system in place, you still may not have the right optics around it or information shared. And then the other thing we see a lot is, employees needing an opportunity, or needing to know what their opportunities are within the organization. So when you're looking at high turnover, you're looking at people transferring, and you go back and do a little bit of study, you find out, they really felt that they didn't have any opportunity within their organization. And a lot of times it's just because it hasn't been, well described or touted. There actually is those opportunities, but we're missing that communication link. And then, information shared is always the other challenge, whether it's the budget, the P&L budget for the organization, or, some issue that's come up that needs to be resolved. Even in the capital planning, like, sharing, hey, this is kind of the vision that's that we're looking at within this organization. And so all those things are gaps in, I think, systems, especially around communication and development, and the people side, that can really create that environment of trust that Lupe was talking about. That, I feel safe at work because I know this information. I know there's opportunities for me, and being able to go in and assess that early on as you're looking at the transformation is cultural transformation is key.
Yeah, so you said something in there that I just really resonated with, and this whole notion about communications, right? And how successful are we at communicating from top to bottom and then having that flow back the other way? And I've run hundreds of Kaizen activities over the years in every industry and process you can imagine. And one of my favorite playbook steps is toward the end, right? You current state, future state, ideation. Here's the things we need to do. Everybody's excited. And then I always like to stop and say, wait a minute. Okay, let's take a few minutes. What would cause us to fail to be successful in implementing these great ideas? And then we just make a list of those, right? Just let them brainstorm like crazy. And then when they're done, we come back and say, okay, how many of these are related to communication? How many of these are related to the process? Blah, 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 blah. And what I see repeatedly is as much as 80% of the reasons we would fail, how to fix it with some form of better communication. Has that been your experience?
Yeah. I've seen that quite a bit, and especially communicating the why, which, we can communicate, hey, we're making this change. This is what the requirement of the change is. So not only communication, absolutely, but the quality and the perspective that that communication takes, I think is very, very critical. I also wanted to expand a little bit more on the aspect of why we really focus on systems, and I'd like to say, as it pertains to that, is as an organization, you want to have a good culture, um, not by accident. You want to have it by design. And you can have a really good culture within an organization and not have some of these systems. And I would say that the opportunity there is you may not be able to necessarily sustain that, you know, over the years, as the culture of the team, the makeup of the team can change, right? Especially if you have, like, hey, I've had team members that are part of our organization that have, 20, 30 years. And now all of a sudden there's a changing of the guard, so to speak, where you get this infusion of new generation. If you don't have those systems, you risk potentially not having the great culture that you currently have. And so being, I'd rather be good by design than just by luck.
Yeah, I love that. So this has been really good. And let's pretend our audience is listening to this and they're nodding their head saying, you know what? We have gaps in those areas, right? There's definitely room to improve. Let's get to the meat of this now. So let's presume all those things are true and there's a significant gap in those areas. What do we do? What's the practical sage advice that you would tell people to go do and bring that into alignment with where it needs to be? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, Lupe, you want to start it off?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, it starts with you as a leader. So one of the things that I would encourage you to do is start to reflect on, what am I actively doing to create, for example, we're talking about the organizational leadership aspect. Okay. I'm not demonstrating the behaviors. I'm not necessarily demonstrating bad behaviors, but I'm not demonstrating the good behaviors. So first thing is to start to map out, what are the things that I'm doing? How much time am I interacting with the people? Because it's difficult for me to demonstrate behaviors that are, if they're not being observed. And so you need to start to ask yourself, what is my face time with the team? Am I going out to the floor? Am I interacting? The social aspect of that is critical, especially the higher you are within an organization, the more powerful that can be. So I would encourage any leader to think about that, but then do that with the clear understanding of what are those behaviors I need to have. And if you don't understand what those are, do some reading, do some homework to understand, okay, these are the behaviors of a servant leader. These are the behaviors of active listening. And, there are many levels of experience within organizational leadership, very veteran leaders, very new leaders, and all of them will have different gaps in their understanding of how should I be behaving. And so it's unique to each individual.
Yeah, and I would add, Ron, to the points Lupe is making, is as we start teaching a new leader, or really kind of helping shape the organization, we like to call out early on that you are not going to have all the answers, and that's okay. And that's really hard, especially for uh, new leaders that feel like, okay, I'm in this position now, I've got to have all the answers. And so, getting started in this space to start, really addressing the organizational leadership and the trust, that environment of trust that has to be created, is really that encouragement of, opening up, letting your peers know that you don't have an answer to this issue or opportunity. Have they experienced it before? And that takes a lot of courage, and it's eye opening when people start to have those conversations and recognize they're not alone. And then the collaboration that starts to take place when you can get that, you know, cross sharing of information and kind of that foundational trust, especially starting with, leadership's, um, leadership positions talking to each other, the silos come down, the walls get thinner, and collaboration starts, and it's kind of an amazing thing. And it can't just stop there, though. Then, to Lupe's point, you have to continue to explain the why we're going through this, or going back to Cotter's, the sense of urgency. Why are we even going through this transformational change in the first place? So all those things, I think, are key, as we look at some ways to start solving some of the gaps that we see, especially in that leadership space.
And lastly, for that, I would add that you want to, as the leader of the organization, you want to, for your team, ensure that there's a clear understanding of what's the vision of where we're heading. And it needs to be very transparent. So, don't have a vision that's on your laptop in a PowerPoint presentation slide. And that's the only place it's at. Like, I personally like to have full transparency, vision, our department action plan, our values, what are our guiding principles? I know using the term that the Shingo model uses, those guiding principles. So, like, this is what we're going to accomplish towards our vision, and these are the strategies we're going to implement. But more importantly, or as importantly, these values or guiding principles are going to tell us how we will achieve those things. And having that clarity and transparency with those elements is very critical from my perspective for leaders to understand.
Cool.
And
Very cool.
yeah, go ahead, Ron.
No, please continue. This is good.
Yeah, and I was going to say, it's the other component, in that space is, that the peer review that you can do within that leadership team, to start giving you some, feedback, and, hey, tell me how my behaviors are. So one of the things, Lupe and I are fortunate to work together, and we're big fans of the accountability ladder, right? And so as you climb the ladder, you're much more accountable. At the bottom of the ladder, you're blaming people. It's you're playing the victim, and so it's good to have those kind of peer to peer. Hey, where you at on the ladder today? Because you're not always at the top of that ladder as you're working through culture transformation. So I think understanding that you're going to have those ebbs and flows, peaks and valleys, and then a way to kind of prop yourself up and have others around you call you out. And so that leadership, self accountability in that space, I think, is pretty important, because you have to continually look at yourself as a leader and how you're performing, before you can really help those high performance work teams, or develop those high performance work teams, and get to that next stage of employee satisfaction, and all the things you need to have for the culture transformation that you're working through.
Okay, so I want to ask a question here then, if I could. So I'm listening, and we talk about the vision and how well we've communicated that down and connected it so that we're not working across purposes. When we talk about X, we all don't understand what X is, and it's not 7 different definitions of what X might be when we have one definition. Do you advocate some form of policy deployment, Hoshinkanri, or some other methodology or approach where you're cascading and basically creating loops of interactions for clarity down through the organization? Is that something you advocate?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, every organization that I'm part of or I work with is, making sure that everything's tied from the company's strategic objectives or the objectives that they've set, the vision, ensuring that as you're cascading through the organization, especially if, let's say, your department manager, it's okay to have a vision that's slightly different than the company's vision, as long as it's not conflicting. If it's conflicting, you're going to create some issues. But if it complements that vision, then that's okay to do that. But what I found is the most powerful aspect of that cascading approach is around ensuring that, if you have a formal review process, performance review process, that those objectives are reflected in each of your leaders and yourself, right? that way you can start to talk to the team around, hey, leadership team, we're all in the same boat here. So your success is tied to my success, is tied to everyone else's success. And so that's when I really find that everything starts to get really focused like a magnifying glass. That light that normally ambient light doesn't do much, but once you get a magnifying glass, it starts to really focus it to almost a laser, right? And you start to get a lot of amazing things that happen. And I know Steve's a great proponent of Hoshinkanri planning.
Yeah, Ron, my experience in Hoshinkanri, I was fortunate to be introduced to it fairly early in my career, and I just found that the first year is always the most difficult year when you set it up. Year following, as the organization becomes very used to it, it improves vision, clarity, communication, and really connects the different parts of the organization to the point where without it, if I went into an organization and they don't have it, it's really one of the first things that I want to start talking to leadership team about is, how do we create this so we're all on the same page and we're communicating within the organization, the focus, and we're getting, feedback from them. I think the other area related to, getting those communication feedback loops going is really the 360 review, and having the courage to introduce those to the organization and be able to take that information back so you can start to work on some things. And Lupe uses this phrase a lot, what got you here is not going to get you there, right? So even though you've got a lot of strengths and maybe got you to this point, to lead the organization and the transformation further, you really got to self-reflect continuously and say, hey, am I doing the right things? You need that peer intervention, and you need the engagement of the high performance work team to really kind of help you know where to help that organization go. And I think when you can create that environment, magic really starts to happen in that space.
Yeah, and I'll add to that the as the organization changes and matures and evolves, you've got to realize that they're going to need different things from you as a leader. It's not just, hey, I whatever the team needs now. Let's say at the onset of a cultural transformation, I would argue is probably going to be more around ensuring that people are bought in, ensuring that people understand why the change is happening, and the comfort level that comes with it. And so there's a lot of face time and a lot of interaction to give people that confidence about, hey, this change is going to be good for us. But then as you're maturing as an organization, then they're going to need a little bit more around, how do we now develop people, and how do we build the systems, and how do we increase people's capability? So now a different leadership aspects may be critical in that moment. And so you as the leader need to be able to evolve in your approach as well, and not just say, hey, I'm just going to be consistent with the way I started it and just do this all the way through the organization, through the transformation. And that's not really what I think is the most effective.
Yeah, you described something there that I want to make sure I'm grasping it the way I think I understand it. Situational leadership. I think about the Hershey-Blanchard situational leadership model, right? Depending on where people are with respect to a change or a task or getting things done, there's, if they don't know anything and we have to start from zero, they have no skills, ability, or desire to do it, our behavior is very different. When you get further out there and they're competent, they've actually demonstrated the ability to do it, and we can delegate and let them just go do, our behavior has to pivot depending, and that's on a person-to-person basis, but it's also true from an organizational perspective. Organizationally, where are we in our readiness, ability, and desire for that to happen? And then we have to behave differently over the continuum of time as you move people through toward maturity where they're truly able, skilled, able, and wanting to accomplish what we need to do. So I see you nodding your head. You familiar with that model?
Yes, and
Yes.
the self-reflection piece is there to look at quickly the information, kind of assess your current state and then be able to move in that direction of where you need to go next is really critical. And to the point, Ron, and I know you've seen this in your careers, that a lot of times as a leader, you have to be willing to move to a new part of the organization as well, right? Because sometimes you have to get out of the way in order for the organization to continue to evolve or help in another space, right? I think that's, being a situational leader and understanding situational leadership and, getting the feedback loops going so you can react quickly, especially at this day and age. And that's kind of the current state is you don't have years to transform culture. It's got to happen so much quicker. And just the amount of inputs, team members are getting within organizations, you've got to really, the clarity and the vision that you create has to really be dialed in because it can get blurred pretty quick with all the other stimulus teams are getting and just part of the current state.
Cool.
One of the
So this
things
has
that
been some. Go ahead, Lupe.
No, sorry, Ron. One of the things that I realized also sometimes can be sort of like this vicious cycle around, especially as you're trying to elevate the, I'll say the capability and the behaviors of your leadership team, is sometimes they've designed themselves into a corner because they have everything go through the supervisor, for example. Like nothing can be done without the supervisor's approval. Well, if that's the case, then if you're asking the supervisor, hey, I need you to really focus on the people aspect of our business versus just the work aspect. Well, unless you're going to have somebody working double time, 2 shifts instead of 1, where's the rest of the work going to go? And so ultimately that has to be handled by whoever is the next tier of leadership or people within the organization. They need to step up to allow the bandwidth to be there so that you can have them focus on the people aspect without giving up the business aspect, right? Because the gears still need to turn. We still need to sell product. We still need to produce product. So that can be a very big challenge for leadership organizations. And so understand that you're almost having to like build a little piece of the capability for that lower layer of leaders, and then add a little bit to the next layer above them. And so I have found myself going back and forth with that until you get to a point where like, okay, little by little, we've moved both of those layers upward in their capability.
Yeah, cool. This is great advice. So you're describing forms of leader standard work that are codified, but are actually modified and flexible over time as things change, as maturity begins to occur. But what's good for leader standard work today may not be like that 3 months from now, because the organization doesn't need that behavior anymore. We have to shift a little bit.
Great
Or it could be
point.
locked down really tight. If you're running a manufacturing line, you're making the same product day in and day out, it's not going to change. But if your product lines are changing, or you're a service organization, or the basis of competition is shifting, or then, one size doesn't fit all anymore, and it has to be adaptable to what's changed. So clearly you guys advocate that. What else would you offer as advice, go-dos to close these kinds of gaps?
One of the things that we've recently introduced into the organization where we work is the book by Adam Lawrence, The Wheel of Sustainability. And the reason that was so important is that we recognized that teams had good intention, that they really started to create that environment for collaboration. They were starting to, work through improvement, but they couldn't sustain it. And so, looking around, trying to come up with a way that we could help the organization, we stumbled across Adam's book, and I thought, this is really good. This is a lot of what I learned back in the Toyota production system days, but put into a concise, I would say, newer version of some of the things that, I had learned. And so that change, I think, is really starting to resonate within the organization because it starts from the senior leadership piece of the organization all the way down to the people that are being affected by any change in the organization. And the quicker you can get through the exercise and understand the 8 spokes, making sure you're touching all of them, the greater the opportunity is for that change to sustain, and or once you create a standard, the ability to go back and look at it and modify it or improve. And so that's one of the things that I would offer the listeners is that's really been a great read for us. Lupe, any other ones you want to throw out there?
No, I think that's been a game changer for us. And to your point, we want to make sure to sustain things. I think when I think of this different systems, right, there's almost an endless number of systems that could be involved in a business. I'm a big advocate of really understanding and focusing your people systems first, and understanding, okay, for example, how do we onboard people? Are we being intentional? I've been part of some organizations that I've walked into where they're like, I'm like, hey, what does the training look like? Well, we our most veteran, experienced operator, they go hang out with them, and they teach them, everything they know, and then they're ready to go. Versus, okay, maybe we need to work on that, because they may be very experienced, very competent, but how do we know they're a good instructor? Right. So instructing, understanding the value of the quality of instructor. I've been taught by someone that knows their topic inside out, Ron, and they've done it, and they've done things so fast that I'm guessing I'm a slow learner or something, but I've had to have them like, hey, time out. Can you go back 5 steps because you lost one? And that's an example of where maybe somebody that's not understanding what it is to be a good instructor. And so again, are you being intentional with the way you onboard and train people? So those types of people systems, the ones that engage their opinion, do we make people feel like they're part of decision making when it comes to problem solving, when it comes to other aspects of our team, or are they just the receivers of your decisions? And so ensuring that there's that partnership, right? We talk about trust. One key piece of trust is that we have to demonstrate that, my position as a supervisor or manager, whatever title you want to use, is irrelevant. We are part of the same team. And so we should be talking at that same level, right? And the biggest piece of respect that I can demonstrate is to treat anyone on the team that's doing the work, the actual work of the organization, the same way I would talk to the CEO of the organization. And when I'm doing that, then I feel like that I'm probably at a pretty good place.
All right. Well, this has been great, guys. And let's pretend, the audience is like, that was interesting, but I'd like to pick Steven and Lupe's brain a little bit, or ask some follow-on questions. How do they get in touch with you to learn more about some of your insights?
Ron, for me, the best way to reach out is you can reach me on LinkedIn, and at Stephen McKeon, and that's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. Lupe?
Well, I would encourage anyone that wants to reach out to us to reach out through us through Instagram or through Threads. Just type in Leadership Exchange Podcast, and you will find a way to communicate to both of us. And we look forward to anyone that wants to expand the dialogue in regards to any of these topics.
Awesome. Good job, guys. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, Ron, thank you. This was a pleasure. And, I'm still filling a notebook with just even the short conversation we had with you today. So I really enjoy the podcast you do, and the information that you're so open to share with others. So thank you for doing the podcast.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, we're big fans, Ron. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Take care, guys.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you for joining MetaPod. For requests on topics or to ask questions, you can connect with Ron Crabtree 3 ways: via email at metapod@metaexperts.com, via LinkedIn, or by calling him directly at 734-425-1455, extension 103. Lastly, if you love the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. We truly appreciate all your support.